As y'all know, I grew up in Kansas. Tornadoes were just a part of life. Most schools in the nation have fire drills, but in Kansas we also had tornado drills. There was a myth that mobile homes attracted bad weather, especially tornadoes. The myth is that a tornado will seek out, so to speak, a neighborhood filled with mobile homes and decide to do its damage there. And the myth made sense when I was growing up, I suppose. Because after a tornado, you could see on the news firsthand that the neighborhoods where there were mobile homes had the greatest amount of damage. But now, being an adult, I know that it wasn't because the storm specifically sought out mobile homes. The storm tried to wreak havoc everywhere it went. But some homes, because of their construction, were more vulnerable than others and inevitably experienced a greater amount of destruction. Luckily, due to the advances in construction technology, it is ensured that modern manufactured homes, we don't call them mobile homes anymore, modern manufactured homes are specifically engineered to endure some of the strongest winds that come along. In fact, today, manufactured homes are pretty much like any other structure that you'd find in a city. If you build it to code, you have a better chance that it will withstand the elements and the storms. The same thing is true in anyone's life. If you build your life according to code, you have a greater chance. In fact, I'd even say you have a guarantee that if you build your life according to code, you will outlive and outlast whatever havoc the world might bring your way. And you can be sure that the havoc is going to happen because it happens to everyone. It's just a part of life. But if your life is built according to code, according to God's standard, you will endure all the way to eternity. Now, what do I mean when I say built to code or built according to code? Paul talks about this in the passage that we're going to look at today. As we've seen in past weeks, and I will most certainly think that we'll see more of this in the weeks to come, the first century church of Corinth was, in many ways, like the 21st century church in America, disjointed and divided, lacking a sense of purpose and direction, missing the point more often than getting the point, lenient when they should be strict, inflexible when they should be tolerant, focused on themselves when they should be focused on the needs of others, and living for themselves when they should be living for Christ. Let's face it, they were a bit of a mess. But in spite of all of these deficiencies and defects, Paul tells them again and again that they are a unique work of God, a work in progress that he will see through to completion. He says it again in today's text. In the final phrase of last week's text, he said in 1 Corinthians 3:9, you are God's building. In this week's text, he expands on that metaphor, and then he says in verse 16, you are God's sanctuary, and the Spirit of God lives in you. I think he'd say the same thing to us today. Every church has their problems, their defects and deficiencies, just as every family has problems, and every Christian has problems. Because none of us are perfect, and we all still struggle with sin. But as God's people, we are his building, his temple. And when we make sure that we build this building, I'm talking about our lives together, when we build this building according to code, we're guaranteed to stand strong. So what is the building code? What is the construction standard? Well, I think in today's passage we can see three requirements that every church and every Christian must consider in order to build a life that will last for all eternity. There are three things that we need to do. First of all, let's make sure our foundation is sure. Back in the 80s, there was an architectural movement in the postmodernist style called deconstruction. It gives the impression when you look at a building that the building is fragmented. They do this by not having any obvious harmony, continuity, or symmetry in the building. The architect designs the building to reflect the random, meaningless, and often absurd nature of life. It's the kind of building that when you see it, you think, what was this architect taking when they were designing this? The Alley Theater in Houston is an example of this kind of architecture. You go online and Google deconstructive postmodernist architecture, you can see all kinds of buildings that fall into this category. If you build your existence on the idea that life is random and meaningless, guess what your life will become? It will become random and meaningless and unstable in every way, subject to the whim of the wind and everything that's going on in the world. No matter how unorganized or how deconstructed a building is on the outside, obviously the foundation of the building isn't built like that. We all know how essential the foundation is to any building. A proper foundation does more than just hold the house above the ground. It also keeps out moisture. It insulates against the cold, and it resists the movement of the earth around it. And according to the guy on this old house, a good foundation should last forever. Without a good foundation, he says, you're sunk. A foundation has to be strong enough to hold a tremendous amount of weight. The average house today weighs about 50 tons. So at the very least, a house's foundation has to be sturdy enough to withstand the weight of 50 tons. Now, I know, some of you are probably thinking 50 tons is nothing. That's almost the total weight of my problems right now. And our worries do weigh us down. There's no doubt about that. If your foundation isn't sure and secure, life's burdens will certainly bury you. Without a good foundation, we're sunk. So what's the foundation that we're to build upon? We see that in 1 Corinthians 3, verses 10 and 11. It says, according to God's grace that was given to me, I have laid a foundation as a skilled master builder, and another builds on it. But each one must be careful how he builds on it. For no one can lay any other foundation than what has been laid down. That foundation is Jesus Christ. So what I'm telling you today is that if your life is built on anything other than your relationship with Jesus Christ, you're going to be susceptible to any storm that comes your way. How do you know when, or how do you know which foundation your life is built upon? Where do you turn when the winds begin to blow? There are those that turn to some kind of substance to take the edge off. Some seek refuge in meaningless relationships. Some just give in to their rage. Some surrender to despair. If instead you'll turn to Christ during difficult times, allow Him to be the foundation of your life, you'll stand strong. As the Apostle Peter said in 1 Peter 1:6, for it is contained in Scripture, look, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and honored cornerstone, and the one who believes in him will never be put to shame. It's also why Jesus said in Matthew 7:24 and 25, therefore, Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a sensible man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the rivers rose, and the winds blew and pounded that house. Yet it didn't collapse because its foundation was on the rock. In order for your life to be God's building, as Paul says, make sure your foundation is sure. Make sure your life is built on Jesus Christ. That's the first code requirement. And here's the second. Let's build our lives together with the very best material. 1 Corinthians 3, verses 12 through 15 says, if anyone builds on that foundation with gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, each one's work will become obvious, for the day will disclose itself, because it will be revealed by fire. The fire will test the quality of each one's work. If anyone's work that he has built survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, it will be lost, but he will be saved. Yet it will be like an escape through fire. Now, in this section of our passage, Paul is talking about the lasting value of a person's ministry, the quality of their work. The work of some is like gold and silver. The work of others is like hay and stubble. And he says that our work will be tested by fire. And on the final day, the results of the test will come in. Now, he's not saying that at the end of our life that you'll suddenly go through a fire, because life is the fire. We all go through the fire at various times. And the fire reveals on that final day what will survive the flames and what will succumb to the flames. This applies not only to those who are in the professional ministry, it applies to every one of us, because we all contribute to the construction of the lives of those around us. Parents and grandparents, you are building into the lives of your children and grandchildren. What you teach them will either be gold and silver, or it will prove to be kindling for the fire. What about your friends? You're building into the lives of your friends. You often have more influence in the lives of those close to you than do pastors and medical professionals. They'll listen to you before they'll listen to anyone else. This is why Howard Hendricks, who was a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, once said, "Show me a man's closest companions, and I can make a fairly accurate guess as to what sort of man he is, as well as what sort of man he is likely to become." Every day, we're building into the lives of others. And we're building either that which will last or that which is sure to burn. When we offer words designed to strengthen, encourage, to comfort, we're building walls made of gold, walls that will survive the flames. And as we consider the construction materials we choose to work with, there are two areas of influence that require our attention. First of all, we need to choose carefully those who will influence the direction of our lives. We can't always control those whose voices we'll hear, but we can, however, control those whose voices we will listen to, whose voices we will heed, whose advice we'll consider, whose example we'll follow. When it comes to who will influence you, be selective. And secondly, we also need to be very careful as we begin to influence those around us. Be aware of the lessons that you teach with your words and your attitudes and your actions. And be aware that if these three aren't consistent with one another, you're building a straw house. As Albert Schweitzer said, Example is not the main thing in influencing others. It is the only thing. If you want to be, as Paul said, God's building, you need to make sure you're using materials that are made to last. And here's the third building code requirement. Let's recognize the sacred nature of this relationship. Now, I'm talking about what we're doing right now, what we do every Sunday. We worship together. We serve together. We learn together. We grow together. And we fellowship together. Paul says to the people in Corinth, don't you yourselves know? Okay, and by the way, Paul uses this phrase, don't you know, 10 times throughout this letter. And each time it's used in what could be considered kind of a scolding manner. The Corinthians prided themselves in their knowledge. And so several times he says, in effect, don't you know this? Because you certainly should know it. But you're acting as if you don't know it. Back to our verse, in verse 16. Don't you yourselves know that you are God's sanctuary and that the Spirit of God lives in you? I think it's important to note that the word you is plural, not singular. The King James translates it ye. The Holman, which I read out, translates it you yourselves. Here in the South, we translate it as don't y'all know? He's saying y'all are God's temple, and God's Spirit dwells in all y'all's midst. That is, I submit, a pretty accurate rendering of the Greek here in the South. Paul is saying that we're not just a group of friends that get together and hang out every week or so. This is a sacred relationship. Together we make up more than merely the sum of our parts. You can go to Lowe's and buy some wood, nails, some sandpaper, and stain for $300 or $400. And if you know what you're doing, you can use these materials to build some custom bookshelves that sell for thousands. That's the miracle of construction. The whole is worth more than the sum of its parts. The same could be said of the church. Individually, we're just a scattered group of wayfaring strangers. But put us together, and we're the temple of God. And He dwells here among us. I grew up going to church every Sunday. My mom was often at the church preparing for Sunday school class or doing associational work. And I knew that there was one room in the building where I wasn't really allowed to cut loose and be a kid. And that was the sanctuary. That's the way it is in a lot of churches. You can bounce off the walls in the fellowship hall. You can run here and there, but there's no roughhousing in the sanctuary. No jumping on the furniture in the sanctuary. No food or drink. No shouting. The room was to be treated with the utmost reverence. But let's not forget where the real sanctuary is. In this church or in any church. The real sanctuary is whatever room we happen to be in together. Right now it's this room and the youth building and upstairs in the fellowship hall where the children are meeting. The sanctuary is not the building. It's the relationship we have with one another. That's how sacred this fellowship is. In Cotton Patch, Arkansas, there was a historic church that burned down because of vandals. In fact, on March 29th of 2022, 3 fires were started by arsonists in town. The church was over 112 years old, and the sanctuary was totally destroyed. And people figured that would probably be the end of the church. since the congregation had been dwindling for years. As it turns out, that building that burned down was not actually the church. It's just where the church met. And so the church continued. For a while, they met in a borrowed room, and then they began to meet in the remodeled fellowship hall. And now, they're meeting in their new, recently built worship center. The website that I looked at recently said that their average attendance was 12 people. A fire couldn't destroy this temple because the temple is not brick and mortar. It's flesh and blood. The pastor said in an interview not long after the fire, "The building may be in ashes, but we are not." Do you know what's worse than someone trying to destroy a church by burning it down? That's someone who's trying to destroy a church by tearing its members apart. Someone trying to prevent worship from taking place, or ministry from taking place, or spiritual growth from taking place, or fellowship from taking place. The person who does this puts themselves at great risk. Paul pulls no punches in verse 17 when he says, "If anyone destroys God's sanctuary, God will destroy him. For God's sanctuary is holy, and that is what you are." That's why we need to take seriously the sacred nature of this relationship. We can't build our lives to code if we're being disruptive and divisive among God's people. That means that before you go into full attack mode on someone who's made the error of disagreeing with you, you need to stop. Remind yourself of who you are, of who they are, who we all are together. We're God's people. We are God's temple. A guy goes into Lowe's, walks up to the counter in the lumber department and says, "Do y'all have 2x4s?" And the clerk says, well, yeah, we have 2x4s. The man says, "Okay then, I need 100 2x4s. And the clerk says, "I need to know how long you want them." The man replies, "Well, I'm going to want them a long time. I'm building a house." Together, we make up God's building, and He plans to keep us for a long time, for eternity, actually. This building we're a part of, this sacred temple, is meant to last forever. That's what the Apostle Peter said about it in 1 Peter 1 verse 5. It says, "You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." This is God's standard of construction. We are His holy temple. So let's build our lives together according to code.